Welcome everybody. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to the third and final virtual session hosted by the New Visions in Theological Anthropology project this year, based in St. Andrews, generously funded by the John Templeton Foundation. My name is Sarah Lane Ritchie. I actually know many of you that are joining us today, but for those of you who don't, I'm a lecturer in theology and science at the University of Edinburgh. Here in Scotland as well. And I'm also part of the St. Andrews Science-Engaged Theology team too. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome a truly stellar group of panelists this evening to speak to the topic, Science-Engaged Theology, Variations on a Common Theme. So I'll introduce our panelists and respondents in just a moment. But just a housekeeping note as we get started. As much as we'd love to see all of your smiling faces, we don't have video for attendees in this session. This is just to assist with preventing any technical difficulties having to do with bandwidth and Wi-Fi and things. When it comes to the discussion time, please just type any questions or comments you have into the Q&A section that you should see on your screen, and I'm sure you've used a million times by now. And feel free to start sending in questions anytime. You don't need to wait until the actual discussion to send those in. In fact, if you have them, as you think of them, just go ahead and send them in. It helps us kind of queue them up in order to get the conversation going quite quickly. And then also, I do want to always note that this session is being recorded, so you will have access to that after the session is concluded. And then one final note is, do we know if we have Kevin Nordby on the call today? Is he here? He is here. Well, just one final note. Many of you will know Kevin already. He is part of the St. Andrews Science-Engaged Theology team. He has some big news. He successfully defended his doctoral dissertation yesterday. He is now Dr. Kevin Nordby, and we are so very happy for him. So congratulations, Kevin. You deserve it. We hope you're able to celebrate properly. I don't know if this counts as a real celebration, but we are thrilled for you and so well deserved.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah. So, right, we are here today to discuss the nature of science-engaged theology. No small task. Most of you will know that there are now a good handful of projects going by the name Science-Engaged Theology, mostly funded by the John Templeton Foundation. These projects, for the most part, seek to engage theologically with one or more scientific subdisciplines to address theological questions. But what is not clear is whether all of these projects mean the same thing by science-engaged theology. After all, each project is led by different individuals, exists in different theological and institutional environments, and has specified different focal points for its research. It is thus inevitable that there will be variations in how science-engaged theology is being understood in each of these contexts and by each of these teams. There are questions such as, what exactly is science-engaged theology? A method, a subdiscipline, something else altogether? Does science-engaged theology work with an implicit or explicit shared set of theological commitments as a sort of root position and then engage with the sciences from there? Or is science-engaged theology more of a natural theology, with a theology emerging from or being derived from the sciences themselves? These are all live questions. There are many others that we could throw in there. And tonight, our goal is simply to talk openly and honestly about whether or not there exists a common core to science-engaged theology, a shared vision or method, or whether the distinct contours and aims of each project reveals differences in understanding that are helpful to get out in the light, in the air, and discuss constructively and openly. We don't view this conversation or discussion as being threatening in any way, but just as a healthy dialogue amongst colleagues, all committed to working productively and constructively at the intersection of theology and the sciences. So there's much to say, so let's jump right in. We're structuring this discussion in the following way. First, we've invited 4 project leads to describe how they understand science-engaged theology, respectively. So Mark Harris, representing his and my God in the Book of Nature Science-Engaged Theology grant at the University of Edinburgh. Jesse Couenhoven of Villanova University, representing the project entitled Collaborative Inquiries in Christian Theological Anthropology. Then we have Meghan Page of Loyola University, Maryland, representing the project Building Foundations in Science-Engaged Theology, Insights from Philosophy of Science. And finally, we have John Perry and Joanna Leidenhag of St. Andrews, representing New Visions in Theological Anthropology. So that's the order that we'll go in for our panelists. After our panelists have briefly presented their views, we'll hear from our respondents also in this order. First up is Peter Harrison from the University of Queensland in Australia, Paul Tyson, also from the University of Queensland in Australia, Justin Barrett from Blueprint 1543, ask him about that later if you want to know what that is, and then Carmody Gray of Durham University here in the UK. After these responses, we'll move to an informal discussion among all of our panelists and then take questions from all of you, our attendees, as we have time. So lots of great material, and we are now going to kick things off. So I am very pleased to turn things over to our first panelist and my colleague, Mark Harris.
Thanks very much, Sarah. It's great to be in this. I think because Science-Engaged Theology is a little bit of a mystery. I've actually been quite provocative in the way I've set my comments up to try to attain some kind of distinguishing marks. But I have to say that in the project that Sarah and I look after, there are some 20 to 30 people involved in that. And I suspect that all of them will have different takes on science-engaged theology, although we're still ostensibly doing the same thing. But I know that I do have a slightly unusual take on this, partly because of my identity, because I refuse to be called a theologian. So I'll give you a little bit of intro to me, which I didn't put in the blurb that's been sent round. So I'll just say I'm a physicist who has become, I suppose, distracted by theology over the years. I still do some physics, and thanks to some very long-suffering collaborators who tend to do the lion's share of the work, I still publish in the area, but it's theology which has most of my attention these days. Now, initially, I have to confess that I wasn't really convinced by the science-engaged theology label, but that's when I first heard it some years ago. I wasn't sure that it really contained anything new that wasn't implicit in the science and religion terminology. But I think that, I've changed my mind over the years, and I feel now that Science-Engaged Theology as a title, it allows me to express how I understand myself as a scientist who's preoccupied by theology. And I say that because to me, and I'll just use the abbreviation SET for ease, SET is a scientific activity. And that's because I've always felt, for as long as I can remember, and this is my personal faith conviction coming out, that science is at least partly a theological activity. Now, looking back in the kind of history of science, and I know that we have some very big hitters here in the history of science, so I'm quaking slightly to say this, but it seems like that this was obvious to some degree back in the era of Galileo, Descartes, and Newton, that science was at least partly a theological activity, and through the golden age of natural theology up to about the mid-half of the 19th century. But there are still many of us working in the sciences today who feel something of the same way. In other words, that science as science speaks to and speaks of our theological convictions that the universe is God's glorious creation. Well, I mean, so much, it's so obvious really to anyone who's read John Polkinghorne, Francis Collins, or many of the other scientists who tend to write from time to time in the science and religion field. But what's special about SET? Well, one thing that's special, I think, about SET is it allows for some pushback against theology. You did hear me correctly there. SET allows for some pushback against theology. And it seems to me that scientism, with its kind of regrettable cultural imperialism, is all too often matched by a theological version of that, which I tend to call theologism, for want of a better word. And in theologism, and you can probably all think of the kinds of people I have in mind here, in theologism, it's perfectly acceptable to assert that theology is queen of the sciences, that the scientific method is mistaken, that science doesn't understand nature. Well, SET is the natural answer, the natural response to theologism, I feel. There's a great paper by Perry and Ritchie that says that SET isn't queen of the sciences. I'd actually go further and maintain that SET is queen of nothing, because SET is a methodology. It has no ontology under its control. Like the natural sciences with which it engages, SET is open-ended and provisional. it has no non-negotiables, nor does it have any results which are fixed for all time. So in the same way that scientific talk of a final theory of everything is an unrealizable pipe dream, I feel, so there could never be a systematic science-engaged theology. Moreover, the God of the gaps isn't a problem for SET. Might be a problem for the science and religion world, but it's not a problem for SET because SET has no interest in understanding the gaps in our scientific knowledge, but in working in the frontline areas alongside the natural sciences. And I also feel it's important to say that SET engages with the current scientific research literature, not with popular distillations where the problems are already solved and the scientific heroes are lionized. You see that again and again in the science and religion field. Please let it not be the case in SET. SET carries out its work where it can in laboratories as much as in libraries. Now, SET has an obvious point of focus in natural theology, which has been unpopular down the years, as we know, but SET maintains that natural theology does have its own worth. It's a legitimate form of theological inquiry in its own right. So natural theology should not be subservient to revealed theology, shouldn't be subsumed within revealed theology, and natural theology, as SET sees it, shouldn't be forced to cohere prematurely with revealed theology. And just my closing sentence, I think this position means that there'll inevitably be areas of friction between natural theology and revealed theology, and between SET and systematic theology, but so be it.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'll turn it over now to Jesse Couenhoven.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. I'm really looking forward to hearing from everybody. I think it's really helpful to have this chance to mull over our perspectives on this topic so that we can all hopefully learn from each other and think a little bit about whether, there are ways in which, in some sense, we're supposed to be doing something the same. We're all engaged interested in science-engaged theology. So are there ways that we can help each other out? Are there ways that we can cooperate? I think conversations like this are really important for thinking about that. So I appreciate the opportunity here. So I guess I'm sort of talking for myself, but also for my co-investigators, Neil Arner and Gerald McKinney, on the Collaborative Inquiries in Christian Theological Anthropology grant. Our hope with that grant is that we'll be able to promote greater literacy, especially in the social sciences, among theologians and Christian ethicists. If there's a difference between ethics and theology, which I'm not too convinced of myself. And also we hope to challenge some of the pervasive conflict myths about religion and science, as well as the idea that science and theology have little or nothing to say to each other. And our sense is that a productive way to do all of that is to encourage theologians to address theologically significant topics in conversation with very specific, relevant empirical research. It's not our view that all theological writing should engage the sciences, but we also think it can be difficult to predict in advance where empirical research is going to bear on theology or where theology might bear on empirical research. And so it's good to sort of explore this in the concrete. I thought I'd offer just a few quick examples of the kind of work that we're supporting with the grant to sort of illustrate this sort of thing that I'm talking about here. So we have about 14 research projects that we're supporting, and some of the people that we're sponsoring with our grant are working on things like the development of virtue, and in particular research on exemplars and how having some kind of admired figure makes a difference potentially to behavior. Another one of our researchers is working on how memory functions in communal and tradition-bearing contexts. Another researcher is working on exploring how human agency functions in a capitalistic context. We have a few people working on explorations of the agency and perhaps virtues that are available to traditionally marginal agents like children or the disabled. Another researcher is working on the role that concepts of race should play in how we understand human nature and how we understand human flourishing. So I won't go on, but those are some examples of the sort of very concrete, we think, projects that we're trying to sponsor. So our view of science-engaged theology is just that it's an aspect of theology doing its proper work, especially in the field of theological anthropology. So it's not a particular method or movement or subfield necessarily. It just affirms a traditional theological view that theology is really only done well if it's engaging the best available research, and that would include empirical research. So our motive is not defensive, not being afraid of what we think science might tell us we can or can't do, but it's constructive. We think theologians will often find it helpful to engage empirical research because that might help challenge or refine or direct or support theological arguments. And I particularly think my own experience is that reading empirical research often kind of expands my imagination. There's all kinds of weird stuff that turns up in empirical research that I wouldn't have necessarily predicted. And sometimes it gives me fascinating ways of understanding claims that have been made, maybe by past figures, for instance. Now, as I mentioned, we share Perry and certainly in Ritchie's view of science-engaged theology as encouraging a focus on individual subdisciplines and correspondingly discouraging highly abstract discussion about how science and religion relate. Science and religion both come in many forms, and as Peter Harrison has argued, there's no one relationship that pertains between science and theology, but many different opportunities for engagements between particular sciences and particular theological topics. For pragmatic reasons, I should say, we are encouraging theologians to engage behavioral or social scientific research because we think that they're often better equipped to do that. I mean, some people have multiple PhDs and they know a lot about physics or what have you, but many theologians don't. And it's our experience that they're often better off working on things that require less technical science training. Just one last quick comment. To talk about engaging science for us is not meant to suggest a paradigm where theologians are blindly allowing science to dictate what theology must say. Our thought is that deeper engagement with science actually allows for very creative and complex relationships between theology and science. In fact, we think that over time, sustained engagements could have great value, not just for theologians, but perhaps for scientists. My own experience, for instance, engaging the field of psychology, social and cognitive psych in particular, suggests that empirical research often needs help, conceptual clarification, in offering theoretical frameworks, in defining terms. And so our hope is that in the long run, this can become a kind of a cooperative enterprise, at least with some willing figures across these disciplines. And maybe there'll be future opportunities for something that some might want to call theology-engaged science.
Thank you, Jesse. Moving now to Meghan.
Hello. So I guess quickly, I just want to say a little something about what I'm doing on my grant, since just to follow what others have talked about. And that is, I am not a theologian. I'm not a scientist. I'm a philosopher of science. And so I see philosophy of science as sort of in service of the general scientific engaged theology community. I guess I don't have strong views about how science-engaged theology should look. I do have views about how people should engage with science and better or worse ways of doing that, especially in this context where I think you can't always directly move from like scientific concepts to theological concepts. And so I guess if we're thinking about this as like constructing a new intellectual interdisciplinary framework, and theology and science are sort of the bricks, I think of philosophy of science as the border. You know, you have to have something that's going to pull it all together and a way to kind of bridge these disciplines. And I think philosophers of science have been thinking about the questions that are relevant to that for a long time. So that's how I see. So largely what I'm doing is running summer seminars and like doing some sub-funding to help people engage with philosophy of science in thinking about how to interact with science. So that's sort of where I fit into the scheme. Okay, so I've been asked to share my vision of science-engaged theology. And I think this is a question about norms rather than classification. So really, I think the question is, what constitutes good science-engaged theology? Which again, for me, is a question about how do we engage with science? So speaking as a philosopher, I don't want to make any strong claims about what theology should be, not only because philosophers are kind of hesitant to make strong claims, but also because I'm coming into this topic as an outsider, and I don't really think it's my business to tell people how to do theology. So instead, I want to make a distinction. I think by science-engaged theology, people might be thinking about one of two things. And one is a sort of theological position or a way that people have approached a theological question. And that's a product or an output. On the other hand, you might be thinking about a methodological approach to theological questions, which is more of a process or procedure. So I think you could ask whether the Summa Theologica is properly science-engaged, or I think you could ask, was Aquinas really engaging with science while he wrote it? And I think that you're going to have different norms of evaluation for what is good science-engaged theology, depending on which sort of thing you're thinking about. So you might think that Summa fails as science-engaged theology unless it takes into account some particular science or particular scientific findings. So, and this is if you're thinking in the first case where science-engaged theology is a theology, a theological position. So if that's what you're thinking, you might want to criticize the Summa because, for example, it relies on a conception of natural species that conflicts with current taxonomies in evolutionary biology. Now, in contrast to that, if you're thinking of science-engaged theology as a methodological approach, then the norms for science-engaged theology will focus on the nature of Aquinas' approach and what was his process like. So on this latter view, whether or not the Summa is an example of good science-engaged theology is really a question of whether Aquinas appropriately engaged with science, if he engaged in science in the right way when he was writing. So like I said, I have little to say about what norms should govern science-engaged theology of the first sort. So I think fleshing that out would require a really rigorous view about the hierarchy of science and what theories apply to what and what the content of scientific claims are. And I don't really have those rigorous sorts of views about science. But I will turn my attention to science-engaged theology as a methodological approach and kind of ask the question, how should theologians engage with science? So here, I think it's worth noting that science usually refers to empirical science. And from an etymological point of view, empirical science is just knowledge gleaned from experience, right? Empiricism. So I think this simple etymological point really cuts to the core, for me, of what's at stake in how science-engaged theology should be practiced. And the question is, how, if at all, do we think science or theology should be informed by experience? And I think that question is open to a lot of tension in the theological community, how different people interpret that question. And there's different reasons for this. So Christian theology has kind of a long history of defining our experience as being in direct tension with revealed truth. And this happens at different levels. So there's this worry about if the kingdom of God is hidden or unseen, how could we learn about it from observation or empirical methods? There's also worries that are amplified by the noetic effects of sin, like why should we trust the observations of compromised observers and what are kind of the limits of our observational capacities. So on the other hand, though, I think that there's like a big space for experience in Christian theology, and it's been one of the epistemic foundations. So Christian theology relies on experience just as much as it problematizes it. After all, God's fullness was made manifest, not in an abstract concept, but embodied in Christ, in whom the glory of God was seen. And the primary epistemological source of divine knowledge for early Christians was a mix of experience and testimony. So again, relying on the senses. So returning then to the question at hand, I understand science-engaged theology to be the practice of engaging with the systematic understanding of experience we refer to as science. But precisely how this engagement should shape theological views, I think, is a really tricky question. After all, we don't want to infer from the way things are that things are the way they should be. or God desires them to be. And I think this is particularly relevant for people trying to do science-engaged theology around ethical questions or like core anthropological questions. And we also don't want a theology that's going to rule out things being the way we experience them as a matter of principle. So again, these are questions about science and norms, which have loomed large in philosophy of science for a long time from a secular perspective. So I think good science-engaged theology then is going to be a theological approach that pays serious attention to science with an eye to the complications involved when translating experience into truth. In addressing these questions, questions of how to distinguish good science from bad science, how to integrate or discern between scientific explanations at different scales, how to extract theoretical information from a sea of complex data, I think philosophy of science is a unique and important resource to science-engaged theologians. Philosophers of science have long wrestled with questions of how to best interpret and understand the methods and findings of scientific inquiry. On a deeper level, I find philosophy of science to directly engage with the question of how experience ought to influence our worldview, be it theological or otherwise. So in sum, I understand science-engaged theology to be an approach that takes empirical knowledge as an important element in a complex theological methodology. And I think good science-engaged theology is going to do this carefully, holding in balance both the clarity and often complexity of scientific claims.
Thank you, Megan. And finally, John, Perry, and Joanna.
Thanks. I think I'm going to do the talking for this first bit, but John might say something later. So when John really, I should say, first used the phrase science-engaged theology in St. Andrews, he meant to distinguish it from science and religion. He was trained, as was I, a millennia later, in the post-Barthian streams of Lindbeck, Fry, Hawass, and Milbank. And so neither of us came to the field of science and religion via Ian Barbour's typologies or via traditional, really entrenched evolution versus creation debates. In fact, for both of us, although a generation apart, we were trained to be nervous about that whole area, about the use of typologies. And in many ways, this was because we were told, be careful, you might end up doing religious studies. And looking back, we realized that this concern was probably very uncharitable, but still very much brought to bear in how we approached this question. So the search for an overarching typology, for relating some mythological transhistorical categories called science and religion, something that Peter Harrison has helped us to see through now, is largely unproductive. And we think it's unproductive because how in the world would we even be able to answer the question, like, is Gould right that they're non-overlapping magisteria, or is Dawkins right that they always have to be in conflict? There are no good criteria for answering these questions definitively, and Peter's historical work has really shown us about why that is, how you can construct it in different ways, and it depends a lot on the particular debate you're talking about, if we can even use the terms science and religion as stable at all, which we probably can't. But what these typologies were good for is showing us how no one approach can concede. And in fact, what we need to do then is a more fine-grained approach. And this is one of the core things, as other people have already brought up, that we see science-engaged theology being about, a more fine-grained approach to the whole thing. So for us, theologians don't need to engage the natural sciences because theology needs a leg up of the cultural status, some sort of borrowed authority. Nor do we need to recrown the theology queen of the sciences, though John and I disagree about whether or not she already is queen or not. But instead, we think the natural sciences offer theology highly specialized tools. And this is in fact an ever-changing set of tools by which we can glean further knowledge about God's creation. And what's helpful about this is first of all to recognize that theology itself already has a multiplicity of tools in its toolbox. We have biblical hermeneutics, we have philosophical argumentation, we have spiritual discernment, we have big systematizing, world-building type thinkers. We have all sorts of tools already being used in theology, and we just want to add the various tools that the various subdisciplines of natural science represent to that general toolbox. And so we don't want to relate science and religion, and so we also don't want to ask kind of these big questions like what is nature, or should we be naturalists, these kind of big, more philosophical questions. Instead, we think SET is best positioned to ask quite much more specific and concrete questions, like should Christians take psychedelics to meet God? And why can't a Roman Catholic priest consecrate gluten-free bread? We call such questions puzzles because they're highly situated, they're very provisional, they're not about the final truth of any particular matter. They're finely grained, and you have to know something about the empirical world to really even ask them, let alone answer them. You have to know what gluten is if you're going to ask the question, why can't a Roman Catholic priest consecrate gluten-free bread? And so that's our broad vision of what we see SET as. But we wanted to end our comments, and indeed these opening comments, by also being fairly upfront and non-defensive about some of the shortcomings that we see in how we've been thinking about SET so far, and some places where we think together we might improve. So on the face of it, SET need not be any more complicated than just theologians should engage the natural sciences, right? Kind of basic principle. We should pay attention to what's going on over there in that other faculty. But in fact, this is still very general and very broad, and it doesn't tell us very much. In particular, the word engage is extremely vague. What does it mean to engage another discipline? You can engage in combat and you can engage in dialogue. The only thing this rules out is probably the strong independence thing, but you can see we're already back in the science and religion typologies kind of faulty way of setting up the whole thing. So this begs the question, has SET improved on science-engaged theology or changed in any way from it at all? So far, just using the verb engage hasn't actually told us very much, we realize. Secondly, when we speak of using scientific data or empirical research, in the past, we think we might have been fairly naive about the theory-laden way that empirical data is already has. And in particular, we've come to realize that empirical data isn't just theory-laden in general, but is already theologically entangled. And that's already part of scientific discourse. And we would call this the John Milbank worry. What this means is that for SET to be successful, it must already contain within it, we think, a theology-engaged science, an awareness that science is already entangled with theological presuppositions, which a scientist or a scientific community may not even be conscious of explicitly, but is already informing why they're asking certain questions, the way that they're asking them, and how they're constructing their experiments. And so we've recognized that we need to hold together a science-engaged theology and a theology-engaged science, but honestly, we don't know yet how to do this. And my last point of further concern is that what we call the John Webster worry, that theology should be properly theological. And that is, as John Webster argued, that theology and theologians should really talk about God, at least some of the time. If not, start off with talking about God and talk about everything else secondarily. But it seems to us that God, in all of God's transcendence, might be the one thing that at least directly SET cannot talk about. SET can talk about the revelation of God in the natural world, and even some forms of special revelation, perhaps. But God in God's aseity seems to be something that SET might not be able to touch. And and this might be a healthy limit upon science-engaged theology. But insofar as theology needs to be properly theological, John Webster might worry then about this whole field. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you to all of our panelists. We're going to turn now to our respondents. I'm not going to give much of an introduction, just let them go ahead and go to it. So first up, we have Peter Harrison. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Sarah. Look, it's been terrific to have seen both these projects, Jesse's and the one that's going on at St Andrews, and also with an eye to what's happening in Edinburgh. You know, I think this is a really terrific, new, fruitful development, and I think it's moving what used to be the science and religion conversation along in really, really very interesting directions. I guess I don't share part of what I think the concern was, that there be a coherent notion of what science-engaged theology might consist in. And I think for some of the reasons that Joanna has just outlined, it might be a number of different kinds of things. And it may be in the long run that some of these work better than others. And that's kind of in the nature of what these new innovative directions, how they go in. So I've actually had the pleasure of seeing a lot of the specific projects that are happening with the St Andrews project, and have already written commentary on those. So I don't want to rehearse too much of the things I've said there about those specific things. And because of the quite diverse nature of the projects that are going on, it's quite difficult to make generalizations. But look, a number of the comments that people have made enable some sort of commentary from the perspective, which was my brief, from the perspective of history. Let me say, as a biographical note, though, before I get to the history, I had the fortune to study at Yale with both Lindbeck and Fry, and Lindbeck's Nature of Doctrine was one of our graduate seminars. And although I make no claims to be a theologian, perhaps that study has kind of stamped on me a version of what theology might look like, I suspect, even though I don't, I'm not consciously aware of that. But so let me see, one of the virtues, I think, is that we're looking now at specific interactions between particular sciences and particular theological puzzles. And I think that's a really good way of setting up the issue. Now, as Joanna has said, the question, though, is, can you still avoid the kind of big issues? And what are those big issues that might inform these specific questions? And I think she's put a finger on what I see as the real crunch here, and that is that the theory-laden nature of the data that you're dealing with. So the claim simply can't be, oh, here's theology, and here's all of this empirical data over here that's sitting there unproblematic that we can then use as a resource. I don't think you can, and I think there needs to be some kind of theological mediation that requires an interpretation of the data, and crucially, I think, an interpretation of the sorts of mechanisms and assumptions to some degree that are implicit that have given rise to that data, which is to say that there are theoretical assumptions that lie behind it. And one of the questions that has to be asked is whether those theological assumptions or theoretical assumptions, Freudian slip there, might or might not be inimical or friendly to what are deep-seated theological commitments. And I don't think that's avoidable. And I think it's a crucial part. It needs to be a crucial part of the exercise. So to some extent, Ben, there needs to be a theologically based assessment of the status of the activities that are generating the data, because the data are inevitably contaminated is the pejorative term, but informed by or structured by you know, some theoretical set of conceptions. And I think, look, you're exactly right to say this is kind of the Milbank problem, but I don't think it's only the Milbank problem. But the sciences, what we know from history, and my own work has been about the positive interactions between theological conceptions and the sciences. But what we know from the history is that the sciences are inevitably and already incipiently theological in certain kinds of ways. And I guess that brings me to the sorts of comments that I think Mark and Jesse and Meghan have all made, and that is, when we look at the historical precedents for these kinds of interactions, what do we learn? And I think what we learn crucially is that when someone like Aquinas deals with notions of scientia, or more strictly Aristotelian natural philosophy, he's engaged in a fundamentally different kind of enterprise than anything like what science-engaged theology must be, because what science consists in bears very little resemblance to natural philosophy. And the same is true for the generation of experimental scientists from the early modern period right through to the 19th century. So the model of theology relating to natural philosophy is not directly helpful, because natural philosophy is not science. It already has built into it a set of theological assumptions about the natural world. And this is certainly true of how Aquinas is thinking, both of a conception of Aristotelian scientia, which bears little or no relation to contemporary science, and indeed natural philosophy, which again bears very little resemblance, except from a faint genealogy, to the contemporary sciences. What do those specific relations tell us? So sorry, let me just cut to some of the specifics. I think it's really interesting that a lot of the people in Jesse's project are coming to talk about the virtues. And I think it's interesting that Sarah's work is looking at notions of formation, because it's at these kinds of levels that the previous interactions took place. And so that the theology and natural philosophy throughout the Middle Ages is engaged at the level of competing notions of formation. Okay, when it's very interesting, I've just happened to have this on my desk here. Great read. It's back to front for me, but this is Kevin Rowe on One True Life. How do Stoicism and Christianity encounter each other in the first century? They encounter each other not as competing doctrinal systems, but as competing forms of life. And I think when we start to rediscover the virtues, what we're not doing is so much science-engaged theology, is realizing that the last 500 years we've kind of been on the wrong track. And if we paid more attention to theology, perhaps we'd be closer to where we're starting to end up. But just to finish up then on what I think is part of the interesting direction of the work on virtue and formation is this, that we also have to think of the contemporary sciences in their plurality as formative disciplines. And the question for us then is whether the formative disciplines involved in the natural sciences are ones that are contributive to a way of seeing the world as God's creation. And there's a big difference between data from nature and a conception of creation. And that's what's, you know, I said this is the last point, but, you know, the constant invocation of the book of nature is a really good way of seeing how this is the case. When people in the Middle Ages talk about the book of nature, they're not talking about nature as the object of the sciences as we understand it. They are talking about it as God's creation. And so the question for us is how we relate the empirical data of the sciences, embedded as they are with implicit assumptions, with a conception of nature as creation, and to assume that those things are the same, I think is the mistake that we need very carefully to avoid. So wrapping up, I think some terrific projects going on. It's very encouraging to see what's happening. What are the potential pitfalls? Well, I think Joanna's actually identified them pretty well, and I've attempted to give a little bit of very quick historical bones to those, I think, well-placed concerns, which are not at all fatal to the project, but something I think needs to be borne in mind. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Peter. Turning now to Paul Tyson.
Great. Yeah, this is like Peter. This is an extremely exciting project, and we're very impressed down here in Australia to see what's going on up there. Just to say a few quick things. So to let you know where I'm coming from, I am trying to do theological sociology of knowledge. So this kind of relates a bit to what Jesse was talking about in the social sciences, and we'll sort of come to that in a minute. But everything our four presenters have said has been extremely encouraging, very much like what Mark talked about, the kind of the friction zone, which I might think of as kind of clutch plates. Okay, so you should expect a bit of heat in order to get proper traction between theology and science, but that clutch plate itself is neither theology nor science in a way. So when Mark talks about there are no non-negotiables, okay, well, there are non-negotiables in theology, but there are no non-negotiables in science. So you've got this slip plate where these two things rub up against each other, and you can get some very useful traction out of that friction. So I would think of this as we could kind of be interested in happy conflict. Okay, so we shouldn't be scared of conflict as if it's the minute you've got some sort of stress that you're anti-science or you're doing theologism. We should expect some heat and some friction, and this is constructive. So really impressed with what Mark's doing there. That's wonderful. And I think it's quite interesting how when you look at someone coming from a physics direction is quite different to someone coming from a social science direction with Jesse's work. And this points to the sort of rich pluralism of the whole field. And we should expect it to be rich rather than simply linear and sort of one paradigm. There are many things going on all the time. There's never actually ever been one paradigm. So let's get over that problem and enjoy a bit of chaos. So that was great. Now, sort of moving on quickly to Jesse. I love the idea. I'm hearing about things happening in the social sciences, like trying to use virtue ethics in economics. So these are the really fruitful sort of areas. And I'd have to say social science is the hardest area of science for a theologian, because it's the area where there's most theory-laden assumptions about what it means to be human. And this is the area where you get most what I would call scientism. So the idea that you can understand what's going on in the psyche or in the mind through sort of reductively empirical and rationalist methods is an enormous problem. How you put theology into that mix, because theology is sort of coming from different angles. But again, it's not really a problem if we're happy with these slip zones, if we're happy with this kind of clutch plate sort of idea. And the thing about the social sciences is they are extremely, it's really obvious when you're being reductive in the social sciences, okay? So it's not so obvious in physics if you're being reductive, but it's really obvious in the social sciences, and particularly in something like studies of religion, okay? So when I'm the object of someone doing studies of religion, it's almost assumed that I'm deluded to believe in God. So my belief is what's being studied, not what I'm believing, and this is a real problem for a theologian with the social sciences. So there needs to be a bit of tension in the social sciences with theology, and I think what Jesse's doing is wonderful there. So quickly to what Meghan was doing, I'd love to hear philosophy of science involved. This is a really important area. What we don't yet have is a philosophy of theology. It'd be really great to see these sort of engagements at that kind of level, where people thinking about what is science engage with people thinking about what is theology. And in both of those areas, they're quite open-ended, but you can be more open-ended in the philosophy of science than you can in the philosophy of theology, again, because there are non-negotiables in theology where there aren't in the philosophy of science. And so this is where I think philosophical theology, the kind of is really important, to be engaged with the philosophy of science. The philosophy of science in the Anglosphere tends to be pretty overly determined by analytic reductive sort of categories, but continental philosophy of science with much more phenomenological sort of windows, again, is really helpful. So I think it's a really interesting zone, and I'm really thrilled to hear what's going on there, Meghan. That's amazing. So lastly, to John and Joanna, it's really clear that there's theology is no one thing and science is no one thing, from what John and Joanna are doing, and therefore there can be no science-engaged theology. There are many science-engaged theologies, and this is exactly how it should be. The only problem with that, as Meghan has identified, is SET almost has to avoid big questions. This doesn't mean big questions have to be avoided. So the way in which SET engages with people who are doing big questions is also a really interesting area. So I think when you're doing science-engaged theology, it's methodologically very important not to do big questions and to be fine-grained and to look at particular problems, and to sort of, for theologians to take the real effort to understand a scientific area, and scientists to take the real effort to understand a theological area where they're both engaging, very important, and to leave big methodological questions that are behind those two engagements kind of outside of the direct engagement zone. But those big areas need to be engaged. And this is where so I don't know if many of you are familiar with William Desmond's work, but so William's trying to recover a meaningful concept of metaphysics after Kant, and that's not at all easy for us. And so the only thing you can't really talk about in metaphysics is truth. Now, you can't talk about the thing itself. You can only talk about our knowledge of the thing, right? So this is a real problem for traditional Christian philosophical theology, which has been profoundly influential on Western culture. So we need to have this lip zone again, these friction plates where the big questions can engage the fine-grained questions. And again, we should expect some heat and we should expect some friction, and that's all kind of merry and happy. I don't think we need to think of conflict in a fearful and ideological way, which certainly was in the late 19th century and is still profoundly there at a sociological level. And this is a big problem, because it's a life world issue where science and religion conflict has become a mythos in which we actually order our world, in which we separate the sacred from the secular. And so anyone who's actually doing detailed work in this area knows it's a myth, but nonetheless, it still profoundly affects the culture in which we live. So to sum up, I think there is no one thing as science-engaged theology, and there can be no one thing. And all the different projects that are going on here are extremely exciting, and it's a richly pluriform field. And certainly from Australia, Peter and I couldn't be more thrilled to see what's going on up there. Keep it going, guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Turning now to Justin Barrett. Take it away, Justin.
All right, thanks. First, along the lines of Meghan's initial distinction, I think it may be helpful to be clear about whether we are primarily considering the relationships among academic domains or with what may be going on in the scholarly work of individual people. Do we want to encourage theology as a discipline to engage the sciences and vice versa, or do we want theologians to incorporate resources from the sciences in their work as scholars? And I favor the latter as being our focus. Second, I wonder whether Mark, Jesse, Joanna, and John might be pushing us toward what we might call science-integrated theology. At least when it comes to many puzzles, progress will come from good, truth-aimed scholarship using the best tools available, whether they be scientific, textual, analytic, historical, linguistic, or others, it seems to me. So as a theologian, I don't need to be too particular about whether there's this thing called theology that engages a comparable thing called science. I just need to be discerning about whether I'm using the best intellectual tools that are available for my particular puzzle and are apt for that puzzle, as Jesse, I think, is suggesting to us. Mark especially seems to be encouraging us to further dissolve the boundaries around theology and the various sciences as always distinctive enterprises. And so I offer science-integrated theology as a possible label for what I think he's proposing. Third, if I understand Mark correctly, and this is where I won't be quite so congratulatory, even though I want to applaud that move, I want to push back on this Queen of the Sciences claims that he and John, Sarah, Kevin, and others have made as well, at least when it, again, it bears on the work of individual theologians or scientists. It seems to me that the reason that theological inquiry can enthusiastically welcome the tools of the sciences, accepting some of Peter's really good observations about attending to what some of the tacit kind of theoretical framings often are, et cetera. But the reason why theologians can be enthusiastic about this kind of integration is that theological inquiry stands in an asymmetrical relationship with those various sciences. Each of the sciences is reductive by method, level of explanation, unit of analysis, or time frame in a way that theological inquiry typically is not and need not be. And so theological inquiry may incorporate and synthesize various sciences in a manner that is not simply reciprocal. So let me be clear, I'm not disagreeing that, for instance, psychological science, where I primarily work, rests upon metaphysical assumptions. I completely agree it rests on metaphysical assumptions that could be rightly be called even theological. And that then psychological science should, at least in some cases, include topics that are motivated by theology in a more explicit way than is typically the case. So I think I'm with Mark on that. I also affirm that this collective science-engaged theology enterprise pragmatically will benefit from the contributions of theologically integrated scientists. Now, I think I heard threads of that in several comments already. Indeed, the scientist must, it seems to me, draw upon philosophical or even theological resources to do their job. A theologian, however, can opt to integrate the sciences into her toolkit or not. And just which sciences are useful and will be handy will depend on the particular puzzle. The scientist really doesn't have a luxury of choice. If she doesn't explicitly and actively claim the theological values and commitments that undergird her inquiry, she'll implicitly adopt them passively. So, to sum, I suggest, number one, a focus on what individuals do rather than the relationship between abstractions. Two, that science and integrated theology captures what I hear our panelists advocating perhaps better than the term science-engaged theology. And three, that even if theology is not to be crowned queen, a science-integrated theologian may be well positioned to be the conductor of the orchestra, the director of the play, or the chief builder of the construction site. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. I'm just trying to remember all of these metaphors and get them written down. Wonderful, thank you. And then our final respondent, we have Carmody Gray. So thank you, Carmody.
Thanks for having me at this gathering. It really is fantastic to be with you all, and at the risk of repetition being boring, it's just so exciting to hear what's going on, to hear about these projects, and so much promise and so much to talk about. And I'm really, really pleased to be here. I'm going to begin by asking 2 questions. We were invited to put questions, and these questions really reflect the shape of my very brief thoughts, even though I have so much more to say, especially after hearing Peter. In fact, I really want to just rewrite what I was going to say after hearing Peter, but I'm going to stick with what I've done, and I'll maybe just make a few extra comments. So the first question is or is not, and by the way, these questions are all meant in the spirit of applause, which I just described. Is set or is not set a distinctive and definable method? And that's question 1. Question 2 is, why would the category of experience or the category of the empirical be any more stable and discrete than the category of science? Or differently put, does set essentialize the empirical? My hunch answer to that is that it does at the moment, but that it doesn't need to, or at least that's an open question, not a closed one. Okay, so let me begin by contrasting something that Jessie said and something that Mark said. Jessie said that science-engaged theology is not a method, movement, or subfield. Mark said that set is a methodology, not an ontology. Right, so I think the divergence here reflects an overall shyness about defining set, as that would seem to commit it to some substantive claims about how things are or how things should go procedurally. And that reflects what I see as the completely laudable emphasis on specificity, on bottom-up investigation, on particular contexts. And that perhaps is the most obvious common denominator of the speakers this evening, that they all see set in that way. But I do notice a divergence in the question of whether set contains any substantive approach or position or angle on things at the level of either method or substance. And this divergence appears even within the presentation of the same commentator. Forgive me, Mark, if I understood you correctly. You said at the same time that set has no non-negotiables, and at the same time that it is a methodology, that is to say that there is something that it is. And it seems to me that there's a tension there, which is reflected across the spectrum of presentations we've heard this evening. Set, after all, cannot be completely open-ended and have no non-negotiables and still have a distinct identity. So the question of what it is and what it assumes can't be shelved, I think. Even though obviously we're at an early stage, you're at an early stage in defining what this is. So this is in no way a criticism, right? But more an observation as a listener. And in that regard, Jessie's comment that set is not a method, movement, or subfield, but a reorientation seems to me, shall we say, a little evasive of this particular challenge. And by the way, Meghan, I thought that you gestured quite nicely towards this ambiguity when you spoke about the difference between a procedural and a substantive way of thinking about science-engaged theology. I don't see this same shyness in the contributions of Paul Tyson, although Paul was a respondent, or of John and Joanna. They seem to be more ready to identify the fact that the questions of epistemology won't go away. And I'd like to, so now I'm now moving, that was my first bit of just kind of being a listener to you all. My second bit, I'll be as brief as possible, is the kind of the really, I think the really important issue, having heard you all, which is the question of how nature and knowledge are constructed, and how that's not a question that can be separated from how set goes forward. That they actually can't be projects alongside one another. I'm disagreeing with Mark here and agreeing with Peter, I think. So let me just say a tiny bit about this. I think the crux of the issue, as I've already indicated, is the way the set project uses the notion of the empirical, of the notion of experience as the mooring that secures theology's openness to science, because that's how I hear it, that's being used as the kind of the sort of guaranteed fallback. This is why we need to engage science in this way, because theology needs to take the empirical seriously. But experience, of course, is not a stable ahistorical category any more than science is or religion is. And I think a lot of working definitions of set do essentialize the empirical. They take it as read. There is something the empirical always is that we can always identify. And in that sense, I feel like what really happens in some of the set discourse that I'm familiar with is that the word science gets, start again, experience is substituted for science. That if you could actually just take out the word experience and put science in, and it would sound very like some stuff that's going on in the rest of that field that you've all been quite rightly saying we need to move on from. Of course, this is to pick up on what Peter was saying, equate science and experience completely underestimates the extent to which the methods of what we call science actually mediate and construct experience and give it shape and content and meaning, and they do that differently in every age. So I'm going to wrap up because I'm aware that we're short of time. But I suppose what I'm saying is it's no good thinking that we can isolate something called experience and then define and identify it as a discrete and circumscribed source for theology as such, let alone boil that down to science, or say that that's what science is and that's why theology should listen to science. The very concepts of experience and the empirical, labeled and delimited in that way, beg so many questions. I mean, for a start, they're presumably incipiently Platonic and Cartesian to make even a beginning of trying to distinguish reason and sense, which is completely fine, except for the fact that they're totally historically contingent. And if we just try and leave that out of the way in which we're receiving certain, shall we say, scientific findings, then there's a kind of really deep naivety there. There's an epoche, shall we say, a bracketing, which is simply impossible. And I think Peter expressed that really beautifully. So actually, the set vision is really driven by a very distinctive epistemology, which is rooted in the history of the West and the history of Europe in particular. And that really needs to be more foregrounded. So we all know what is the methodology that set is, because surely it is a methodology. And if it is a methodology, surely it's an epistemology as well. And if it's epistemology as well, surely it's probably an ontology as well. I mean, that's way too quick, but I hope you see the direction I'm going in. I don't think we can get around questions of substance, questions of epistemology, questions of ontology when we do set. And that is not for a moment to say that we need to fix all of those things before we actually do the set projects, which I think are hugely valuable, but simply that we can't separate them either theoretically or practically, I think. So sorry, that was really condensed, but thanks very much, everybody, for everything you said.
Thank you very much, Carmody. And thank you to all of our respondents and our panelists. I know it's been a bit of a whirlwind. We are now going to move into a more informal discussion amongst our panelists and our respondents. So if you are an attendee and you have a question in mind, as we are having this discussion, please do start putting those into the Q&A, and we will move on to those immediately after this part of the discussion. So yes, I'm going to open the floor now to our panelists, our respondents. Questions of each other, responses to each other, burning things that you just don't want to let go. Have at it.
I want to jump in really quick and respond to Carmody, or at least try to get some clarity. So I think I'm someone who really ties this idea of experience to science. And I totally think it's historically contingent, but I think that we live in the context that we live in, and we have to work from the contingent distinctions that were made and the way that they have evolved and shaped our disciplines. And so in that sense, I'm like, yeah, I got to deal with the history that we got. So in that sense, that's why using the term seems relevant to me, because it's like a term that's become entrenched in the way that ideologies have evolved, whether it ought to have been that way or not. But I also kind of want to, it's like, I find that what I hear in people's perception of philosophy of science, both with Paul and Carmody, and my experience of it seem really different, because I feel like there's this assumption that in philosophy of science, we have these robust categories of the empirical or the physical or the, and a lot of general philosophy of science over the past 100 years has been precisely challenging that, or trying to wrestle with the theory-ladenness of things, or to prove the theory-ladenness of things, right? I think contemporary philosophy of science as it stands now was founded on this worry that we can't cleanly define observation terms away from theoretical terms. So I see philosophy of science as sitting in these questions, and philosophers of science, at least general philosophers of science, as having sat in them for a long time and come to some interesting conclusions. Again, they've formally proven that you're not going to sort the a priori and the empirical. So I don't think that it's this idea that if we bring in philosophy of science to this conversation, or that philosophy of science is somehow, posing extra contingent historical distinctions upon the field of theology. To me, that just seems a misnomer. Really, I think what's interesting here is for a long time, people have been asking these questions outside of maybe a theological context, but still in the context, like a theory building context of how do we make sense of science and the way that it engages our senses and the way that it engages formalization and the integration of mathematics and how these tools interact and how that interacts with other ways we have of thinking about knowledge. So it's just not clear to me why, one, we would like want to exclude that from SET, or we would want to like try to adopt some categories that exist outside of the like contingent history that we have, rather than just go from here and move forward.
Sarah, is it okay for me to quickly respond? Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Meghan. So just to be clear, my comments were not directed at philosophy of science. And actually, had I had a bit more time, I would have said the engagement with philosophy of science is surely one of the most essential and productive areas of this conversation. I really agree with Paul about that. And by the way, also really agree with Peter, because obviously the history of science and the philosophy of science are really intertwined, that these engagements are absolutely critical. My comments were actually directed against framings of the SET project, which try in some way to seek some sort of, if you like, some sort of stable conceptual mooring for the project that I think avoids or circumvents, or maybe even just silently passes over that historical contingency. And in that sense, philosophy of science is precisely the dialogue partner that is required for science-engaged theology. I mean, this is why, maybe I'm revealing too much here, that as somebody who works in the field, I read philosophy of science and I read history of science, but I very rarely read what passes for most of what passes for theology and science, for exactly the reason that you just described. So that was just a really long round of saying yes.
And I would quickly say that, in fact, the Millbank worry, as we, John and I termed it, was in large part influenced by reading Carmody's comments to our modern theology special issue that will come out next year. So we do owe her a gratitude in pushing us on these points. I just wanted to say that.
Am I allowed to just quickly say to that, one of the things that I really liked that you said, was it you, Joanna? I'm now getting muddled. That it is a Millbank worry, but it isn't only a Millbank worry. You know, that he's put his finger on something that I think many of us have been aware of, and he just is a very handy poster boy, you know, for this concern. And you know, it's kind of fun to call it the Millbank worry, but I think fortunately it transcends him, hopefully. But thanks, Joanna.
Jesse, go for it.
Oh, sorry, who's next? Jesse.
So, yeah, Mark, did you have something on that point?
No, it's more general, but no, Jesse, go ahead.
Okay, well, Jesse then Mark.
Okay, thank you. Well, just quickly tying, relating to the theory ladenness of a lot of empirical research, or maybe all empirical research, I wanted to comment briefly on Paul Tyson's words about this. I think you're right, Paul, to say that the possibility of happy conflict is one that we should not shy away from. And I think you kind of started to make a helpful distinction between this sort of mythos of conflict that we want to maybe push back against versus the possibility of kind of a positive conflict with some of, for instance, with some of the presuppositions of various aspects of social science research. I mean, my interest in work on hope and forgiveness, for instance, very much impels me to want to push back against some of the things that happen in the empirical research where the definitions of the terms are bizarre, as far as I can tell, et cetera. So, but you know, that leads me to say this. I think this is a real opportunity. The fact that the social sciences are so obviously philosophically and theologically freighted, I think is a kind of an advantage for us in some ways, because it's in some ways I think it's easier then to call that out and to comment on it, sometimes to push back, but sort of embracing the theory-ladenness of the social sciences, I think, is one of the potential advantages for theologians, actually.
Before we move on to Mark, I just want to ask, or I'm going to pose one question as a follow-up to that because it fits very nicely with what you were just saying, Jesse. This is from Kristen McCurlin, and she asked, how do you figure out the theoretical subtext of a particular empirical study? I worry about misunderstanding what's not explicitly stated. So on that theory-laden nature of data, do you have any, I don't have any insights quickly on how you go about understanding it if you're not kind of an expert in the field?
I mean, the quickest thing to look at is what are they measuring? So, I mean, just like a quick heuristic is if you're reading a study that says we found da, 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 it's like you want to know what kind of terms are they using as measurement terms and what kind of ways are they using to measure those. So this comes up all the time in like, you know, undergraduate philosophy science classes, if we talk about research on happiness or something like that. Well, what is happiness? You have to, like, within a study, they're going to have to define how they have quantified this term in order to make a measurement. So you want to look at like specifically what is the quantitative data. Unless you're doing something where you're working with qualitative data, then you want to see how they've coded it. This isn't like a philosophical response, but I just think that's kind of a...
Thank you. It's really useful. Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. No, I just wanted to say a really big thank you to everyone because this is so helpful hearing these various views, both those who set out views on SET and the respondents as well, because, you know, this is a new area which we're all trying to make sense of. I did have a few comments on various things that people said. So, I mean, this is just to pick out, so many things were said, they came so thick and fast that I couldn't note them down quickly enough. But a couple of things that I really wanted to, that I thought, oh, yes, quickly write that down. Happy conflict, really like that terminology. Also, Paul, you mentioned about social sciences being the hardest to engage with theologically because the data are so kind of theologically entangled. Yeah, I can entirely see that. I'd also like to say, though, that by the same token, the physical sciences and particularly physics, I mean, it's no accident that so many physicists end up making very strong metaphysical statements out of their science. Because it's just so easy to do it when you're kind of talking about the universe and what underpins it, either for or against theological beliefs. Justin, your comment about science-integrated theology, I guess I take that as read, actually, that underpins a lot of the science and religion field, but we're trying to move on beyond that in a way. But that might be something that merits further discussion, because I'm not quite sure that the integration makes me think of Barbour and his fourth typology. So I would have said, you know, let's move on from that. But I'm interested you say it. And Carmody, you said so much that I simply couldn't note it down in time. But what you did say made me feel even more certain that I wanted to stick by the non-negotiable aspect of SET. Because for me, it really is a methodology. And I actually said, I changed it from the text that's on the that was published. I said SET has no ontology under its control. And I tend to believe that insofar as SET has an ontology, it's the ontology of the natural sciences that it's engaging with. But it brings a kind of set of interests. It brings some reference points from, you know, traditional theological claims. In fact, I would like to, one thing that I would critique the respondents for is that I think nearly all of you were too ready to throw around theology at the same time as SET, to the extent that it became very confusing whether we were talking about SET, which is a very distinctive thing in my mind, compared with the kind of wider task of theology and other branches like systematic theology and biblical studies. So I personally think we need to be quite careful about our language at this point. But just to wrap it up by saying thank you so much. That was a really, really helpful set of responses.
Justin, would you like to respond to Mark?
I would. Thanks, Mark. I guess first, yeah, by integration. So because I want to focus on what it is that I, as a scholar, am doing myself. Am I integrated is the question, which is slightly different than whether these domains, which I think are just reified abstractions and kind of nonsense. So I agree with most of you in that regard. Let's not go there. Let's talk about what I'm doing and whether I'm bringing, as a scholar, the relevant epistemological tools to bear on whatever it is that I'm studying, the best stuff available. So am I integrated in that respect? So am I, if I'm a theologian, am I an integrated theologian? And so that's more what I mean. So I think it is moving past Barbour's kind of distinction. So for instance, Malcolm Jeeves had a recent book out dealing with psych science integration, and he wants to reject the integration kind of language. But that's, I think, because he's talking about these sort of abstractions, not about what's going on in me. So that's part of how I would respond to that. So I actually thought I was on your side there, because what I see that scientists is doing, at least this scientist is doing, is trying to grapple with certain kinds of bigger questions that you might rightly call theological, and being inspired and instructed by theological frameworks, and then going, all right, now what are the right kinds of tools for bringing empirical data to bear on those predictions? And that's kind of where I'm not sure I agree with Paul, about the idea of the social sciences, at least the psychological sciences, being all that hard to engage, at least on this level. When I read lots of theology, I hear theologians making claims about how people think. I hear lots of claims about, if you engage in this particular practice, ritual, discipline, these are the things that follow from that, that will happen to you, that you will experience. Well, those are empirical claims that then the tools of certain social and psychological sciences, it seems to me, can sort of readily explore. Are the theologians making accurate claims in that regard? Why not, sort of go after those? But then that's an illustration, then back to Mark, of the point that, yeah, I think we're talking about, let's dissolve these sort of boundaries and just talk about what does it mean to be an integrated person exploring these theologically rich kinds of questions.
Any other panelists or respondents like to chime in here? Peter, and then Paul, I think.
So just trying to get the unmute here. Look, there's just a series of thoughts. Yeah, Carmody, I think you've exactly put your finger on it. It's the kind of reification of the empirical. That's kind of what I wanted to say. And you just can't naively accept that empirical is sitting out there ready to be appropriated. But the question, Sarah, that you brought to us about how do you detect the incipient, implicit, unspoken theoretical commitments, I think that's a really hard question. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that. Coming from my discipline, I think it's the history of the disciplines that shows us how the social sciences, for example, historically are a project to replace theological explanations. And in a way, I think this brings me to Justin's point that when Augustine says something about our experiences, yes, he is making an empirical claim at some level, but the question for us is, do the contemporary social sciences have any authority that might lead us to think that Augustine might have got it wrong? And I think part of the difficulty in assessing that is a point that Jesse made about the fact that the categories that are used in the contemporary social sciences so rarely map onto the theological categories. And when we conflate those, we just get into a complete muddle. But finally, the point I want to make about the incipient thing that I think underlies all of the sciences necessarily from the 19th century is naturalism. And it's the naturalistic assumptions that we haven't even asked that question, it seems to me. And that's what makes the study of nature scientifically very different from a Christian conception of the creation. And until we grasp that nettle, that the sciences necessarily are informed by a commitment to naturalism, at least methodologically, that seems to me the very first barrier between the very easy appropriation of the data of the sciences for theological reflection.
Thank you. Sorry, real quick, Paul, did you have your hand up? Okay, let's do Paul and then Carmody.
Thanks. Justin, look, I love the social sciences, right? They're so fascinating. What you can learn about the world from studying people is amazing. But what I suppose I was talking about is that there, as Peter mentioned, there is you have to quantify data when you study anything in a social science mode. That's not the problem. It's the interpretation, it's the hermeneutics. And if the interpretation excludes transcendence because of naturalism, because of Thomas Huxley's secular naturalism, right, then we're in a lot of trouble. And that has been how the social sciences have been used, as Peter points out. And it's kind of fascinating to me that it takes a historian to do Theology 101 for us. You know, that if you look at the history, you can see how theology has been replaced by science, particularly in the social sciences, and has kind of overreached itself to make these big claims about what life can't mean, right? And so what you're doing, Justin, is magnificent in looking at psychology and thinking theologically about the soul. And I love Kierkegaard in this area, because in the 1840s, you could still do theological psychology, right? And we need to kind of recover that sort of thing. So yeah, it's the hermeneutics, it's the interpretation. And if there is an empiricist hermeneutic in the room, we're going to have trouble as theologians. And this is, I think, what Carmody is pointing out. You can't get past ontological implications in epistemology. They're always there, and any methodology. And so how we make the methodology and the big enough to allow different epistemologies to friction each other, and different ontologies to be in the same room, and there to be a constructive chaos that produces something. This is our challenge, and I think this is what SET has a very valuable role in doing, but it's not the whole picture. It's one part of the picture, and I think if SET's quite careful, as Mark was saying, about keeping its focus tight, and in a way saying, well, look, these questions are unavoidable, but that's part of the other things going on in the room, those bigger questions. In the end, it is unavoidable, as Carmody's pointing out, but I think the sort of the humble scope of SET is an extremely important feature of what we're trying to do at the moment.
Thank you, Paul. Before we go to Carmody, I want to integrate an audience question here, because I think it fits nicely. Just trying to work through some of these alongside our panelists' responses. This is from Dan Koch. He writes, "It seems to me that since I have been born into a theologically pluralistic world, if my main search is for the truth, then I should try by default to avoid theological non-negotiables. To try and universalize, someone born into a cult or radical fundamentalist sect would be foolish to hold certain self-evident non-negotiables." So basically the question here is non-negotiables. Agree or disagree? Just anybody.
Am I carrying on, Sarah?
Go for it if you like.
That was a hand grenade in the middle of my in the middle of my thoughts. Just wanting to briefly respond to this question of, okay, so things are theory laden, but how do we tell what the theories are? Two things. Number one, at the risk of being a bit too quick, I think the really important thing is to ask the question. It's the awareness that there are things going on that aren't instantly visible to us that is so important, and the disinterring of them is the actual work of research, among other things. But simply to be posing the question is the important thing, and to be suitably and fittingly agnostic about the answers depending on our training and our reading and so on. So that was a kind of a resounding yes to the question. Secondly, I think that maybe Peter couldn't say this quite as emphatically as I can. I really think history is the key. It doesn't take much exposure to the history of the conceptualization of these things to see the way in which the theories are inhering in the concepts. And in that sense, I think that there's far too little history being done in these, not these in this room, but in this field. That people are move too quickly, and this includes 100% me, by the way, and I'm preaching to myself, moving too quickly to the normative and the descriptive at the expense of the historical and, if you like, the genealogical. And I think that's the most important way of gaining awareness. And at the risk of quoting somebody who's getting mentioned a lot, I'd have heard Milbank say history is the real theology. And I think that's partly what he means, that theology is, among other things, a kind of intrinsically genealogical. Finally, on non-negotiables, this is a tough one, and there's way too much to say about this, but incredibly briefly, there may be theological non-negotiables, but the way in which those non-negotiables are expressed probably isn't non-negotiable. And that distinguishing between the way they're expressed and what's being underlyingly asserted as essential is a really important work. And so, although we can all understand that the theological enterprise kind of depends on some things being true somewhere down the line, maybe not rushing too quickly to identify what they are or how they should be said or how they should be arranged in relation to other things, allows us to sit a bit more lightly and not to fall into that trap that you just described a second ago in your question of, well, what if we're fundamentalists? We need to be, we need to be saved from that. So just distinguishing between what is non-negotiable and how we say it in any generation, how we conceptualize it.
Thank you. Others, Meghan.
Yeah, this is kind of a follow-up on what Carmody was saying, but I have a general question. Well, a question for Joanna and John in particular, which maybe extends to other SET projects. I get a little bit lost. I find that a lot of this idea that SET's going to be sort of discipline specific and look at narrow questions. I'm like, okay, but then when I see the questions, I don't really understand how science is supposed to contribute to thinking about these questions, because the questions are, one, almost always normative. And it's really hard to get from science to normative questions. And so to me, like, the interesting question of SET is, what's the bridge there? But for example, Joanna, like the questions that you mentioned, one, should we take psychedelics to meet God? I mean, this is just inherently a normative question. And I don't really know what scientific tools you're going to use to answer it. I mean, you can take psychedelics and meet God, but like, that's not going to be an answer to the should question. Like, so it's hard. And the same thing with the gluten-free Jesus thing. I don't like, do you put wafers in communion dishes and see like, well, this one grew into Jesus, but this one didn't. So I guess we can transubstantiate one, not the other. Like, it's just really hard for me to get a hold on what you're going to do in that setting. Like the whole thing with Descartes, which I did a deep dive on this because I was like, what are people talking about that science would be relevant to here? And found out there is a theory that Descartes was poisoned by a priest who was mad about his views on transubstantiation. It's because there was this whole shift when you went to the mechanists. You don't have a way to appeal to kind of like the Thomistic qualities and say that substance is different from an accidental quality. So you can't explain why we don't see the observable difference when the hosts are transformed. But all of this to say, like, that question is supposed to be detached from experience on purpose, right? Like questions of what's happening in transubstantiation. So it's just not always clear to me how SET is supposed to answer these really narrow questions. Like, what is the bridge? What's the empirical bridge? What's the empirical connection? What's the experiment? Or like, how does that work?
If I could just follow up after Meghan there. I mean, this is precisely why I think there are no non-negotiables in SET, because we're working with the sciences. We can't be normative in the way that theology would like to be. That's not to mean that there are no non-negotiables in theology, though, because I see that as a wider discipline calling upon a wider ontology, history, and all the rest.
John, do you want to answer Meghan's question, or do you want me to have a go?
You can start, but I message a question to Sarah to read out for me.
Okay, well, I think the important thing to say in response, Meghan, is I think you think that we think that science can do more work than we really think it can do, or at least that I think it can do. I should really just speak for myself at this point. So as I said in the question about gluten-free bread, so that question is a question because the Roman Catholic Church says we cannot concentrate gluten-free bread. Like, we didn't make that up. And so we're like, but why? And the answer to the but why is going to be a theological answer, but it's clearly gluten is not a self-evident concept, right? It's a scientific concept, discovery, whatever. And so it's not that the definition of gluten, say, is going to decide for us whether or not transubstantiation is true, right? It's just that there's been a concrete. This is more like what this example is more like what Justin was saying about theologians make claims that are use empirical. I'm nervous about saying that word now. That use empirical data or scientific concrete kind of concepts and ideas from the natural sciences, and they make claims that natural science is already informing in some sense, and so we need to be engaged with that natural science if we're going to understand what the theologian, or in this case the Pope, is declaring, and then debate it. So that one's quite a minimal puzzle in that the science of gluten isn't doing any theological work in deciding whether or not transubstantiation is true or anything, but it has to be part of the conversation. There will be other puzzles that maybe the science is doing a little bit more work, but it is largely, it is often descriptive. It is often helping us become more fine-grained in our theology, more nuanced and precise in our theology, but it's not making, I don't think, ultimate theological decisions for us like transubstantiation or consubstantiation or something like that. I think that would be an important clarification that I worry you're misunderstanding us on.
I guess I just think then it's hard for me to see, because as far as I can understand the gluten-free question, it's because there has to be wheat, which I guess wheat is a scientific concept, but and the reason why it has to be wheat has to do with kind of tradition. So I guess to me that just seems like a really minimal role for science. Like, I in some sense envision a larger role for science, but I don't know how you could make that role happen in these kinds of questions.
So I might move. So the gluten-free one was John's puzzle, so I feel a little nervous about exploring it more. A puzzle I've worked on is, does the indwelling of the Holy Spirit require a neurotypical brain? And the science is doing a bit more work there. It's responding to theologians who are talking about a particular form of relationality, of second personal relationalism, the potential now debunked idea of mirror neurons, to make theological claims and then exploring that. And in fact, in that sense, I'm actually trying to deconstruct, in one sense, a science-engaged theology that's already been going on. But what it means to relate to one another is both a scientific concern and a theological concern. And so that's a less minimal area of overlap. That might be a better example then to think about. But
John, did you want to jump in here? Your mic's.
Yeah, so did you get my written question?
Yes, I think.
It's mostly repeating the old gluten story, but just to point out that I thought of it more in response to Carmody's challenge, not Meghan's question. So I heard Carmody saying, you in set are verifying experience, but as so can you take over with the written question now?
So you're saying that it's not often set that thinks that the scientific and experiential claims matter it is in this case the Vatican. So in Science-Engaged Theology, we're simply saying don't do a bad job when you use experience in theology. Did you want to add anything on that, John?
Yeah, I think that covers it. But yeah, so when we were working on that first grant, we were thinking of examples when theologians use scientific claims already and they do a bad job of using the science. So if the Vatican or the CDF says that you cannot consecrate gluten-free bread, we want to know why and what is bread and a host of related questions. So I don't know if that relieves or pinpoints to Carmody why we might have sounded like we were verifying experience.
Yeah.
Help?
So, I mean, what you're getting at here, and yeah, is this this notion that theologians are already engaging experience in some way. They already are, and they have been for a long time, and they're in this, at least in some level, engaging science. Then, and so we view our task as being as much about doing it better and just making explicit maybe some things that are implicit and just doing a better job of it than perhaps has been done on certain issues. And that's the backstory with the gluten-free thing in particular.
I don't know if it's appropriate for me to respond. I feel like I've spoken a lot and maybe someone else is going to want to come in on this.
Sure, go ahead real quickly if you want. Yeah.
I'll try to be quick. I think that the project of elaborating and illuminating the ways in which what we think of as experience or empirical concepts or scientific concepts are employed in theological discourse and checking that they are actually employed in a way that is consonant with their home in whatever discourse they come from is a really great one. Fantastic one. It's like a kind of good housekeeping for theology, and to make sure that theology is actually joining up with the way that other people actually speak, which is a really helpful thing for theology. So nothing of what I said was meant as any kind of dampener on that, whatever it might look like in a given context. And that's why I'm fundamentally enthusiastic about the SET project. What I was trying to say was, when we talk about science, we all now understand that we're talking about an epistemological world picture, right? That is to say, we're talking about a way of constructing what it is to know something. And the point I was making really was simply that substituting empirical as an adjective or experience as a noun for science doesn't mean we're not doing that anymore. We're still doing it, because even in the conceptualization of those terms, we are buying into a certain account of what it is to know something, what it is to know. And theology is also engaging in a whole set of suppositions and narratives about what it is to know. And there are really big gaps there, which isn't necessarily a problem, but it is a thing. It's a thing that needs to be taken seriously and exposed. And I was suggesting in my remarks earlier that history and philosophy are two of the best ways that we can do that. Particularly, I think history, certainly that this awareness has grown for me in the context of history, history of science. So all I'm saying is just not to be naive about the way in which how we conceptualize the object of science-engaged theology's engagement actually already assumes an account of what it is to know that is anything but external to what theology is about.
Okay, John, did you want to respond to that? And then Jesse?
Just briefly, yeah, it is. I agree wholeheartedly. Just to point out that this is precisely why we wanted to narrow down and not speak of science as such. Keep as much as possible those to the subdisciplines, because there might be a whole overarching view of science, but there is, in fact, many little narratives of biology, physics, agroecology, or whatever. So that was our thinking. Whether that solves or alleviates any of your worries, I don't know, but leave it there.
Okay, Jesse.
Yeah, just briefly on the question of the epistemological work that's important to doing science-engaged theology. I mean, I think it's absolutely correct to say that one needs to do epistemological work and certain kinds of projects in philosophy of science, I think, as well, in order to do good science-engaged theology. So in a way, I just want to echo what John and Sarah, I think, have just said, which is that there's a kind of a corrective element, at least the way that I and the team that I've been working with are thinking about science-engaged theology, sort of a, well, you're going to do this, you're going to cite empirical studies, but you need to do it a little bit better. And I think Justin has already said this to some degree as well. There's always stuff being cited in theological texts, but a lot of the time the engagements are very ad hoc or overly defensive. And so our hope is that with a little more training and a little more time to think things through, people can do a better job on these engagements. And that's partly in understanding the history of where these publications come from, to understand the presuppositions that often are unstated in their background. A little bit more of a systematic approach to certain literatures can go a long way in helping people figure out what to make of them and where to push back or how to appropriate. And so our hope then is just that we're giving people maybe, I would say, a kind of a skill set that they can use in the service of their theological work. And wrapping up quickly, I think this is why I wanted to say there's not a definite methodology involved. I mean, yeah, are there some epistemological and methodological commitments to what we're doing? Absolutely. But having been trained at Yale, you know, back in the day when there was like the Yale School and the Chicago School and which one are you part of, we're trying to avoid something very strong or thick when it comes to methodology, because we want to kind of equip people with these background skill sets.
Great, thank you, Jesse. I'm going to combine a comment and a question now because I think they go well together. The comment is from Alex Arnold, and he writes, a focus on history and genealogy is important, but it can distract from first-order concrete work that would fall under the banner of science-engaged theology. The particle physicists needn't recapitulate the whole history of physics to fire up a particle accelerator. Social psychologists needn't review the whole history of social psychology in order to conduct an experiment. Likewise, the theologian who considers evidence is drawn from her reading of scientific literature and doing theology need not recapitulate the whole history of science. And combining that with a question from Myron Penner, he writes, well, I think that the theory-ladenness of scientific data means that scientific practice reflects often unacknowledged theological assumptions. I can see maybe how the data reflects philosophical assumptions, but why think that those are automatically theological in nature? Put another way, can you have science-engaged theology without philosophy? Probably not. But can you have science-engaged philosophy without theology? Seems possible. So two distinct questions, but perhaps some overlap there. Any of you like to address those? Joanna.
Yeah, I want to start. I want to say respond to Myron's question primarily. And no, I don't think you can do science-engaged philosophy without already doing theology. But that's because I don't think you can do philosophy without secretly already doing some theology, because I think God is goodness and truth. And I think philosophers are engaged in those knowledge of those things. And so I mean, this is a very theological answer, but I just don't think, I mean, I think if you're trying to do, I think obviously people try and do philosophy without explicitly Christian commitments or monotheistic commitments, but they're still doing, therefore, a kind of atheistic or agnostic theologizing. We just don't call it theology, we call it philosophy. But I really don't think there is much hard and fast between these two disciplines. Perhaps there are different norms to the disciplines and kind of centers of gravity, and I'm worried about what Meghan's thinking as I'm saying this, but I just don't believe in the division in the way that you asked it in this question.
I mean, I guess just I'm sympathetic to Myron's point. And so I guess my question back to you, Joanna, would be where, like, and I don't mean this adversarially, but legitimately. So I don't know where to think about the theology in questions of like, our observation terms theory laden. Like, I don't know that I have to have presuppositions about God. And when I think about what people were doing when they were working on that project, I feel like they were really trying to do this kind of formal project of, let's see if we can take these terms and define them in a way that is purely empirical. Now, you might think that like to assume you could do that would assume some view of how we are created in nature, but I don't think I think the question was an empirical question, like, can we do this? And it turned out they couldn't. But I feel similarly about a lot of projects in philosophy of science now, things like, you know, can we make sense of causal explanation in historical biology or evolutionary biology? And I don't think of that as really a theological question. I think of it as a philosophical question and trying to understand, like, what is causation and how is it working here? I mean, I guess, again, you could put some theology in it, like all causal things involve God, but at least in how the project's approached, I feel like those are intentionally sidelined because of the way we're trying to work in community to answer these questions in a framework that people mostly agree with. So I don't see how those questions are like necessarily theological. They don't assume things about human nature or about metaphysics. It's really just looking at these theories and trying to make sense of what are these sorts of explanations or something.
Yeah, I think this debate goes back to the disagreements that different members of this conversation have had about the Queen of the Sciences question and how I side with Justin. So it's not that every question we ask has to involve God explicitly and immediately. I mean, that would be quite quickly fairly ridiculous. But the reason I still accept the notion of Queen of the Sciences is the kind of asymmetry Justin was talking about, I should say. The question, you can ask a scientific question that's a properly scientific question. You can ask philosophical questions that don't immediately explicitly invoke God in how they're asked or how they're answered. But behind all of that, there is going to be a theology at play, unspoken, in these smaller questions. And so it's not of the immediate, as you say, you can work with people who don't share the same theology as you in community, and that's really important. But there is going to be, if you push the questions back far enough, there's going to be a theology there at the end. And it's because I would place theology there at the end or the beginning of the conversation, depending on which way you're working with this. But if you're starting with a small concrete question, then it's the end of the conversation. Then theology does provide this larger context in which we think about things and break down our smaller questions.
Thank you, Joanna. We are running out of time. We have more questions. I'm very sorry. I want to close with one final question that's actually very provocative. This is Tobias Tanton. This seminar seems like the most non-SETI set seminar, insofar as it is asking big picture methodological questions without engaging particular empirical findings or doctrines. Is this a performative demonstration that science and theology is inevitably doomed to be pushed back to these meta questions? So good. Thank you, Tobias.
I thought it was an empirical question, which is what do people think of set? So we're answering it by asking people what they think of set, which is a pretty empirical method.
Thank you, Meg.
I think it's always important to do some methodological work. I mean, that's kind of what I was trying to say before. Like, there's a role for having a sense of what your approach is. But I guess for me, it's important that it be minimized and not the whole thing. And again, that's partly coming out of my background, where a lot of work that was ostensibly about theology turned out to be about what could one say if one did theology, which I thought was not very interesting. So you got to have some sense of what you think you can say and how and why. I think that's right. You want to be sophisticated about that. And maybe, that means that you have to talk to Meghan and learn some stuff. But then you want to go on, and I think this is part of the point Alex was trying to get at. You want to engage concrete work and do specific things and try to come up with something that is interesting and theologically rich, and certainly in my case, hopefully normatively significant as well.
I accept Tobias's well-made point. So I hereby decree no more methodology for the rest of the year. We have talked through this all, and now Tobias can get back to his narrow questions.
Yeah, thank you. It's true. I mean, I find myself personally cycling back to methodological, very basic fundamental questions every couple of months or so. Yeah, I think it was like yesterday, Mark and I had a 2-hour conversation about exactly these sorts of things. And it is a sort of like cyclical thing where you find yourself going deep into specifics, kind of coming back up for air and asking yourself, how are we even basing any of this, and like what is happening here in the first place? So thank you for that, Tobias. I'm very sorry. We have to close things up there. Thank you all so much for such a stimulating conversation. Just before we go, I want to just make a note that the St. Andrews Science-Engaged Theology Project is inviting applications for several things. We have the Summer Fellowship in Science-Engaged Theology, course development grants, and also funded work on theological puzzles. So most of you will be familiar with those, but you can find more details on the NViTA website, which I think you all know where to find. So now it's just we're just left with the task of thanking all of our respondents, our panelists. This was a sort of a marathon session, and I and the rest of the St. Andrews team are really so grateful for the time and the effort and the energy you've put into this. Such great conversation. I'm so glad this has been recorded because I know I'll be revisiting it. So thank you all very much, and have a wonderful weekend.